Hi, everybody. I'm Scott, and thanks for joining me again today for another edition of the accompanying podcast to the film Skin on Skin, the rise and fall of the world's largest furrier. Today, I have a very special treat for you, friends. Today, I am going to play for you, mostly in its entirety, my favorite interview in its entirety amongst the 30 or so that I've done in preparing these documentaries for you. And apologies to all my friends and family and those that were involved in the film, but this was the most special of all the interviews. You're going to get a lesson in fashion history, in store history, in business partnership history, in immigration, in the history of Houston and Texas and the rise and fall of the economy in the Southwest. What I have for you is a really special treat. It's my entire interview with former CEO of Sakowitz Stores, Robert T. Sakowitz, who spent a glorious mid-morning with me one day, throwing back and forth war stories about Evans and Sakowitz and him and the Meltzers, and it's a real treat for you. So enjoy. I'll kick in a few times and see you on the other side. So first, Mr. Robert Sakowitz, tell us a little bit about the history of yourself and your store and your family and
How much time do you have?
well, let's do the short version.
Short version, my great-grandfather came to Ellis Island in 1886 from conscription in Russia with his eldest son, leaving the rest of his family about 20 miles south of Kiev. But by that time, back then it was Russia. The Russians didn't even like the Ukrainians then, much less Jews. And so they were going to be conscripted. They knew they were cannon fodder. So he left his wife and two other infant boys, small boys, and a girl, and came into the port of entry in New York. They couldn't read Cyrillic Russian. So Tchaikovich, which Cyrillic Russian looks like an S, I guess, and an AK, and an O, and a W, and ch at the end, Tchaikovich. She looks like an upside-down question mark, so they said, it's IGZ. So they created our name as Sakowitz. And he couldn't get work in New York. There was a group from Galveston, Texas, which was at that time in 1886, second only to New Orleans as a port and the most important Wall Street of the Gulf at the time. All the shipping, it was a great port, cotton, cattle, all kinds of rice, all kinds of produce. And got a job there peddling, needless to say, as a lot of us did. Made enough money to then send for the rest of his family. And that's how my grandfather came. He was the second son. He and his younger brother, ultimately, there were no child labor laws, so they started working immediately, about 12 years old, something like that, by the time they were 10 or 12. And the mother saved some money, and at the ages of 21 and 19, respectively, my grandfather, the elder one, they started a little gentleman's haberdashery, which back then was collars and cuffs and ties and that sort of thing. In Galveston, fast forward, Houston was growing. Galveston had another grand hurricane. The Great Hurricane of 1900 is still the largest natural disaster in American history. 8,000 to 10,000 people perished. They built a seawall and tried to come back. 1915, another great storm came. Wasn't as bad because they had the seawall as far as lives lost, but commercially, that was it. So my grandfather and great uncle moved up to Houston, and expanded with Houston as Houston grew. The port of Houston started in the ship channel. The Houston Ship Channel opened in 1914. And Houston was thriving. World War I, World War II, it became an industrial capital. And we grew with it. We started only in men's and then men's and boys. And then, too long a story, so I won't say it, but Jesse Jones, who had been head of the Reconstruction Finance Corporation with FDR, was head of the War Industries Board, was from Houston. And he was kind of Mr. Houston, wanted everything to grow on Main Street, told my grandfather, I'm going to build a store on Main Street to nail down, we're going to build Houston north-south, not east-west, the way some other people want to. And you're going to take the first 5 floors. And my grandfather almost fell over. He said, how am I going to do that? He said, look, I'll pay for the furniture, fixtures, and equipment. You go lease out to other people, lease out a woman's department. You know, that's the way it was done back then. So lease out a millinery and a shoe and women's apparel. And so they did, and they opened a store on Main and Rusk in the Gulf Building, 5 floors, Sakowitz Brothers. It was immediately successful. They did all these women's, men's, children's, but under the Sakowitz name. And continued to grow. In 1949, it was growing so much, and Houston was growing so much, they wanted to really build a wonderful new store. And so expanded and take over all those lease departments and run them themselves.
Before we go any further, let's show you the trailer to the movie Skin on Skin, The Rise and Fall of the World's Largest Furrier.
Who doesn't love a rags to riches story? But a rags to riches to collapse story?
There were 2 Evans furs. The one that climbed to the top of the highest peak, amazing story, and the one that tumbled from that peak decades later. But that's not the tragedy. The tragedy is what happened in between.
They lived the American dream, and they let a lot of people come in and live it with them. And it was a wonderful story until it wasn't.
Coming from a generation that was so driven and willing to work 18 hours a day to be successful, there aren't that many people like that anymore.
They created something out of whole cloth, and he helped kings and queens around the world with their fur coats.
That was the era, I would say, the golden era of department stores and specialty stores.
Genetics loads the gun, but it's the environment that pulls the trigger.
Non-existent parenting, and so they didn't learn how to cope with stresses.
And I just look at the damage that my father created and the things that he has said.
It certainly caused a significant rift in the family and families, and a number of us didn't communicate with each other for a long time.
You marry into the family, you marry into the business, because that is your life.
Clearly, there were problems.
So was this the lease department thing was the natural trend for stores like this? And then was there a trend back to your ownership of them?
Well, there wasn't a trend to necessarily take them back, but they realized that it would be more profitable if they could do that, and wanted to expand and do it on their own. as far as your first question, was that the trend? If you go to Europe, even today, to a lesser degree, go to China, Asia, most of the stores would lease out space. It was just a vertical mall, but they'd lease out space to manufacturers. So that even when I was an intern at Galeries Lafayette after I graduated from college and went to work in Paris, they were still leasing space for manufacturers, giving them the equivalent of stores within a store. And that was the manner in which it actually worked as a European system. John Wanamaker and several others were the first to buy merchandise on their own account instead of leasing. So if you bought the merchandise on your own account, you made the gross margin instead of just getting lease payments. So that's what they did. I don't recall in 51 who, I remember his name was Lowen, George Lowen, spoke with a Slavic language accent. I don't know whether we had leased the furs or whether the fur department or whether he was an employee. So I can't remember in 51 whether we actually started like that. So I also don't remember exactly when we turned the lease over to Evans. Perhaps there's something in the documentation that you can find, but I don't know what date it was.
But this is in the grand time, like the 50s to the late 70s is the grand time of retailing, especially it was at Evans. So like your business is exploding at this time as well, yes?
This is 51, and Houston was growing. You have to understand, I believe in 1950, if I'm not mistaken, the population was like 250,000. 1960 was 550,000. In 1970, it was 1.1 million. I mean, it doubled every 10 years. Houston just being the growth leader. And so I do remember a lot of relationships because my father had his first heart attack in 1965 at the age of 58. And as he's coming out of the ER, he's got tubes in his mouth and tubes up his nose, and he's ashen gray. And I'm holding his hand, and he said, "I'm going to feed you with a fire hose because I want you to make as many mistakes as possible while I'm still alive to try and help." And by the next year, it was like throwing me in the ocean, sink or swim. I was executive vice president, general merchandise manager of the company, age 27. So we remember an awful lot of the merchandising, launching a lot of European goods because of a little bit of my experience. And Neiman Marcus had the lock on all the women's specialty designers. And back then they were all exclusives. We couldn't get those exclusives because we hadn't been in the women's business, had this long-standing relationship. So we had some of the Los Angeles designers, the Hollywood designers, Helen Rose and Jean-Louis. But the French have a great expression, on cherche le créneau, look for the crack, and then drive a wedge in it. European couture was always couture, but they didn't have their own ready-to-wear. It was called confection. And basically the top designers over there would sell a model to Maria Carine or Mendez, who would then have the rights to reproduce that as ready-to-wear, and they were the manufacturers. So I heard about that when I had been working there. I flew over in the mid-'60s, right at this time when I was executive vice president, flew over and I said, let me see if maybe we can use the European designer names and have an up on Neiman's that way, or at least be competitive, more competitive, by having some great fashion names. Well, of course, one of the challenges is that the fit was different. So it's not quite like the fur industry. It really depends upon the way in which the body is formed by each manufacturer, all the specifications. European women back then, compared to the American women, were slightly narrower shouldered, not as smaller busted, bigger hipped, and shorter from the nape of the neck to the waist. This is more than you want to know, but it just
Based out to me, I'm the student of this, and this is great.
yes. So we saw that differential, that it just didn't fit that well. I mean, I remember hearing one of my top salespeople talking to a lady coming in, and I'm writing a book, and this is in this book. The book is called More Than a Store, and it is the 3 decades of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, the era of those stores, where there's colossal fashion change, social mores changes, the civil rights, Vietnam War, changes in the economy, OPEC, all of this happens from 1960 to 1990. And those are my store years, actually. So there are a series of vignettes, one of which includes a trip to Leningrad, about which I will tell you in a moment, with David and his wife. What was her name again?
Sharon.
Yeah, Sharon. Right. So I've got a great photograph of Sharon sitting in one of the furs, and David sitting behind, and me sort of sitting on because they're steps. And they're the steps to the Hermitage Museum, where we were photographing for our Christmas catalog shots some of the furs we were buying. And it's a great photograph. Anyhow, so I don't remember exactly when we started, but I do remember being involved a little bit in the fur business and meeting David and being with him. I remember a trip to Chicago that was probably, I think, on record, the worst snowstorm that Chicago held. It must have been in the 70s. I don't remember when, either the late 70s, early 80s. But there was snow up to the top of the cars that were parked on the street. It was that bad a snowstorm. It was unbelievable. Anyway, I remember, socializing with Sharon and David, and I remember us being in business and meeting all the people at the company. And we had a very nice business in Houston because people traveled, and they knew that a good fur coat was a great symbol of success. So I also happened to have we started a penchant for starting new things and experimenting, just as I had launched Courrèges, Yves Saint Laurent, Givenchy, all those people. I did their prêt-à-porter, they're ready to wear, and launched them in the United States, not just Houston or Texas, in the U.S. And each one has a story, but that became extremely successful. And with those fashion leaders, I could get other people now from New York wanting for Sakowitz to sell them, because if we had these other big fashion leaders, then clearly they would be willing to put their merchandise with us instead of just Neiman. So we became quite competitive. One of the things that we used as a promotional tool in the beginning, but then as an actual business, was, as I'm fond of saying, long before the internet, there were catalogs. And the golden age of catalogs was in this period roughly 1970 to 1990, 95. And we became extremely competitive with Neiman Marcus. They would have his and hers. And I came up with this idea to have themes instead. A theme of 3, 4, 5, 10 different ways to express that theme. So the gift of knowledge, because this came from people coming up to me and saying, I want something that's really different, Robert. I want something that's unique in all the world for my husband or my wife. Okay, what do we do? So it had to be the ultimate gift. And that's what we call these, the ultimate gift. Whereas Neiman's was his and hers, ours were the ultimate gifts. And the ultimate gifts, for instance, the gift of knowledge was lessons in skiing with Jean-Claude Killy, lessons in how to bust a bronco with Larry Mahan, World Championship Rodeo, lessons in how to dance from Mitzi Gaynor, lessons in economics from Elliot Janeway, lessons in conversation with Truman Capote, lessons in just about anything with George Plimpton. And these were all things we got prices from their agent, and we put them in the book and sold a number of them. Well, one of the things that I fashioned upon, because one of our customers they were always looking for something different. And I said to David, what's the most expensive fur in the world that would be totally unique? And he said, clearly, Robert, it's a Russian crown Borgesian sable, and only available, in Russia. I said, well, how do they grade them? How do you know, is there a such thing as a best? Oh yeah, absolutely. You go through, they grade them, there's top of the line, there's skins, and da-da-da. He said, but I'm not going to take a chance to go over there, and that's too much risk. I said, okay, what if I can pre-sell it before you? I said, you get it pre-sold, we're going to Leningrad together. So I got one of my oil friends who had a beautiful wife, model statuesque, and he said, I'll do it. Absolutely. John Meekum wanted to do it for his wife, Cassie. So I said, okay, we're going to want to put it in our Christmas book. So let us, try and sell it. But if we don't sell it at that price, there'll be a fallback price that I'll work with you, or we at least cover our cost at a little, and you guarantee to buy it. With that agreement, we set out for Leningrad. Anyhow, we went over. That in itself is a lengthy story. As I said, it's in the book. It's one of the vignettes. But we spent 3 or 4 days in Leningrad at the auctions. And we literally saw the bugs up in the ceiling. So we knew we were being spied on, because if they knew what we were buying, they'd shill someone to be able to up the bids all the time, because that's what the Russians were doing. They were trying to get as much dollars as possible. So we used to go out in the snow, literally outside, like Gorky Park, and talk about which numbers and the bidding. I've still got the book, as a matter of fact, the Soyuz Pushninya catalog. And the problem was that it was to be a full length, or what's called opera length coat. Well, the bundles were numbered and put together in such a way that was enough for a regular dress length coat, top of the knee. If it was going to be opera length, we'd have to buy 2 bundles. And not only buy 2 bundles, but one had to be lighter than the other in weight, so that the sweep and the bottom would be wider and would also drape properly on the body. But it also had to be matching perfectly, so that when they were let out, all the cuts, they could be put together and end up with a uniform look. We went through and we'd go through and grade, and I learned more about the fur business in those 3 days than anybody ever could. I mean, with other circumstances. And we'd go back, and David and I mean, we'd all talk at night. We'd sit at dinner by ourselves and go out. Long story short, we bought the top bundle of skins. 2 of them to match. Plus some other lesser sables, lesser only than the top, but they were gorgeous. And the only other thing that Russia has that's totally unique compared to, as you know, from Gorky Park, sables, is Russian lynx. Because Russian lynx, because of the weather, because of the inbreeding, whatever, is far more luxurious than Canadian lynx. Canadian lynx is good, but Russian lynx is better. So we bought the top bundle that we could find of Russian lynx as well.
So when did you start to see a shift in things? You know, in the fur industry, it was, in my opinion, a combination of the mass production and cheapening the product to make it available to everybody, combined with the anti-fur movement, which then affected the demand. But in the non-fur business, in the retail and ready-to-wear business, when did you start to signal this shift? And then was it parallel to what you saw happening in the fur business?
Well, in the fur business, PETA had a lot to do with it. You know, the people against the fur, use of furs and pelts, animals, all that. Ours was also, the fur business began to drop off in our part of the world when the economy shifted. We boomed in the 70s with OPEC and everything. All of the oil-producing states, Texas being the biggest among them, Oklahoma, New Mexico, to some degree California, were really favorably impacted. And people had a lot of money. They bought furs. They bought couture. When OPEC basically crashed, oil dropped from $49.75 a barrel, its high, to August of 1985, $8 a barrel. And the economy was destroyed because it wasn't coming back. And more banks and commercial real estate and businesses went under than any other place or at any other time, even more than the Depression as far as Texas was concerned. The Depression of 1929, 32. So we had to file for a restructuring at Chapter 11. We were able to come out of it with a partner from Australia who bought Bonwit Teller and B. Altman. But then the flash crash came along in 1987, 88, 89. And New York and Wall Street were really hurt by that. So that there was a recession in 92 in the early 90s as well. And when people don't have that kind of disposable income and they're worried about paying the rent, they sure as hell ain't thinking about buying fur. So the combination of changes in the economy, changes in social mores, changes basically in our culture, really put a damper on the entire fur industry. And, when the 11 came along, David was very trying to assist us, wanted to stay in business. They created a separate little area of their own, right near us. We were fighting for our lives. And of course, Jerry Gronauer was running that for Evans.
Yep, I remember him well.
Yeah. And that was the demise of the Evans relationship with Sakowitz.
So
We reassured, we came back in, but then it didn't. Evans didn't want to take the chance of that risk. Jerry then left them to run our fur departments. And so he left being the manager of Evans Furs to stay with Sakowitz as manager of the Sakowitz Furs on our reorg period.
wow, so even at that point, you didn't abandon it.
I'm sorry?
Even at that point, you didn't abandon furs.
No.
Skin on Skin, The Rise and Fall of the World's Largest Furrier is a 3-part series. So here's the trailer for part 2, which, even if you haven't seen part 1 yet, you'll see what's coming down the pipe.
Julius and Rose Meltzer went forward with the belief that their son's death was an accident, and this setback rocked the family during a time when brother A.L. and Herman's Evans Furs was skyrocketing to the top of the industry.
Those Meltzer kids obviously weren't taught how to cope or how to parent or relationship skills were really lacking, and that got passed down.
DNA really plays a role in any, in anyone's well-being.
All I know is that he had a photographic memory, he was brilliant, and the family loved him.
So she was always, like, I was her little doll. She loved, but she was very interesting and fun and vivacious.
All of his grandchildren wrote reports on Nuremberg at some point in school. Someone would always have an assignment, interview some relative about something.
Nonchalantly would toss a question out, and the beads of sweat were pouring off as he's trying to answer Uncle Bernie's question.
A lot of people live in fear that, oh my God, is that going to happen to me?
In the end, a lot of people got hurt. A lot of customers got hurt because their coats weren't there. And, it was just a bad thing.
Not for nothing, we were supposed to be life. You know what I mean? We were following, that suit.
I'll never forget it. He threw this dinosaur, toy dinosaur, on the table, and he says, "This is what Evans is." And you know what happened to these dinosaurs?
That wasn't what the legacy that he wanted for himself.
He didn't want to wake up and smell the coffee, so he just, he did the things that he enjoyed doing.
Interesting. So tell me, with the last few minutes that we have, what do you think about when you reminisce and you reflect about those times, the good part of the times, forgetting the demise stuff? Because I saw it in David and my family, and my grandfather and great uncle, before David, just like you with your parents, and so that was like a really special time in retail and it was in merchandising.
It was. I mean, I became president of the company, and in 69, 70, we were doing about 32 million. I took it to 165 million, which today would be $1.6 billion. I mean, it's 10 times. That's the value of the dollar. And we expanded all over. We were in Arizona. We were in Tulsa, Oklahoma. We were in Houston, Midland, Amarillo, Dallas, and a catalog store. It was a separate store. So it was a really boom period if you just kept going. We were privately held. Neiman's was held by a public company, and they were all over the country. So they could survive with their out of Texas, out of state stores. Chicago, all the rest of them did very well during that period when we were collapsing. One man's meat's another man's poison. And it's a whole nother story. But it was a very unique era of launching new product, of what turned out to be the youth quake, a youth boom, all kinds of innovation, new music, new everything. And just post-Vietnam tailed off. And then ultimately, along came other aspects of this. The country became overmauled. Internet came along. I mean, today, Neiman's, Nordstrom's, and Saks, all three, if I'm not wrong, each have at least 30% of their business online. But the problem is they're returning stuff all the time because it doesn't fit necessarily. The three things that they still don't have right, that we could never get right in the catalog: fit, fabric, and color. And so those three things, you have to see the garment.
Yeah, that and I would have the fourth being able to interact with the item. Correct, right?
Yep. So that was the era, I would say, the golden era of department stores and specialty stores. And everybody was, put it this way, when it was just like the little girl with the curl in the middle of her forehead. When it was good, she was very, very good. When she was bad, she was hard.
That is a great way to wrap up for our time today. I want to thank you so much. Come on. I told you that was going to be special, didn't I? Some great, great stories there, some great history. I told you. So I want to thank Robert Sakowitz for his time and for participating in the making of the documentary, Skin on Skin, The Rise and Fall of the World's Largest Furrier. I'm Scott Hunter. I'll see you again soon. Thanks for joining us.
On the next episode of the Companion Podcast, in support of the film Skin on Skin, The Rise and Fall of the World's Largest Furrier.
And the first thing she did was make me sign an NDA. I said, okay, I signed it.
He said to them, if you have an extra $10,000, put it into Pepsi because we're going to take on Coke and it's going to be the next big thing.
Robbins, the chairman or the president, Michael Gould, he will not allow a beer that didn't use vulgarity, foul language. It was all just real happens. And he just made fun of it. It was great. And he said, he was sitting and eating his lunch. I mean, he literally stopped to talk to me. And he said to me, would you like it? So sat down, I had my lunch. I don't think I ate any of it.
On the next episode of the Companion Podcast, in support of the film Skin on Skin, The Rise and Fall of the World's Largest Furrier.